I've been driving trucks for over a decade. Long haul, cross-country, nights spent on empty highways where the only company you've got is the glow of your dashboard and whatever's lurking just beyond the reach of your headlights. You hear a lot of stories in this line of work. Some are just truck stop gossip, exaggerated for effect, but others you know, are true. I never thought I'd have one of my own, but I do. It happened 3 years ago. I was driving through West Texas, a long, empty stretch of I-10, somewhere between Fort Stockton and El Paso. That part of the country is desolate, nothing but dark hills, dry brush, and a sky so vast it feels like it could swallow you whole. I was hauling a load of auto parts, and the company had me on a tight schedule. It was close to midnight, and I'd been driving for hours. Fatigue was setting in, but I wasn't about to pull over. Not there. I had stopped at a truck stop earlier that evening, just a quick refuel, grab some coffee, stretch my legs. While I was paying, this old man sitting at the counter gave me a look. You know the kind. Like he knew something I didn't. He said, "You be careful out there tonight, driver. Stay out of the rest stops past mile marker 308. I laughed it off, said thanks, and went on my way. I should have listened. A couple of hours later, I felt my eyelids getting heavy. I had to stop. I saw a sign. Rest area, 2 miles. I checked my GPS. Mile marker 308. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why the hell didn't I just keep going? But listen, when you're out there alone, exhausted, common sense gets real blurry. I just needed 10 minutes. Just a quick nap before I became a hazard on the road. I pulled in. The place was empty. Just a few dim security lights, a couple of vending machines humming in the silence. I parked, killed the engine, and reclined my seat. As soon as I closed my eyes, something felt off. You ever get that feeling? Like you're being watched? The cab was dark, but outside the moon cast just enough light to see. I glanced in my mirrors. Nothing. Just the empty lot and the long stretch of road beyond it. Then I heard it. Tap. 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 3 soft knocks on my driver's side door. I froze. My blood turned ice. I didn't see anyone. No approaching footsteps. No shadows moving across the lot. But someone or something was right outside my truck. I locked the doors, turned the key halfway so I could roll the window down just a crack. "Yeah?" I called out, trying to sound casual, like I wasn't scared shitless. Silence. I waited, listening. My breath loud in the stillness, then tap, tap, tap. The same slow, deliberate rhythm. My hand went for my flashlight. I shined it through the window. Nothing. The lot was still empty. I was alone. I was done. Screw the nap. I was getting out of there. I sat up, about to start the engine, when I caught movement in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the light. Tall, thin, not quite human. It didn't move like a person, more like a puppet. Jerky, unnatural. Its head tilted to the side as if studying me. I felt my stomach drop. Then it started walking. No, gliding. It came closer, moving without sound, without effort. I reached for the ignition. My hands were shaking. The key slipped. I fumbled, cursing, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I looked back up, it was at my passenger door. I don't know how it moved that fast. 1 second, it was yards away. The next, it was right there, inches from me. It didn't have a face. Or maybe it did, but it wasn't one I could understand. Its features shifted, blurred, like a reflection in a broken mirror. It raised a hand, long, bony fingers tapping on the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I slammed the key into the ignition, turned it, and nothing. Engine wouldn't start. I swear to God I could feel it looking at me, studying me, enjoying this. Then in the silence, it spoke. Not out loud, inside my head. "Let me in." I screamed. I don't even remember doing it, but my foot slammed the pedal and the engine roared to life. I threw the truck into gear, tires screeching as I tore out of that rest stop. I didn't stop, not for miles. Not until I saw the glow of a truck stop up ahead. I pulled in, jumped out, ran inside. The cashier looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. I grabbed a coffee, tried to steady my hands. That's when I saw him, the old man from earlier. He was sitting at the counter, stirring a cup of coffee like he'd been waiting for me. "You stopped, didn't you?" he said, not even looking up. I nodded. My mouth was too dry to speak. He sighed, shaking his head. They don't like to be ignored. I asked him what the hell I had seen. He just said, "Things out there ain't meant for us to understand. They've been here longer than the road, longer than anything." He finally met my eyes. "You're lucky. It let you go." I didn't feel lucky. I finished my coffee in silence, hands still trembling. I didn't sleep that night. or the next. Even now, I don't stop at rest areas. Ever. I keep driving no matter how tired I am, because I know what's waiting out there, and next time, it might not let me go.
Story number 2.
I've been driving rigs for nearly 20 years. The road gets lonely, sure, but I've always found comfort in the hum of the engine, the steady miles ticking away beneath my tires. I used to think I had seen it all. Snowstorms, tornadoes, wild animals running across the road at night. But there's one night I can't explain. One night that still keeps me up when I think too hard about it. It happened 6 years ago, somewhere in West Texas. A long stretch of desolate highway, nothing but oil fields and desert in every direction. It was around 2 a.m., and I was running behind schedule. I hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. Just the empty blacktop stretching ahead of me, lit only by my headlights. Then I saw him. A man walking along the side of the road. I barely caught him in the beams of my high beams before I sped past. He was tall, thin, wearing an old suit that looked like it had seen better days. No car, no bags, just walking in the middle of nowhere. I'm not one to pick up hitchhikers, but something about him stuck with me. Maybe it was the way he walked, slow and steady, like he had nowhere to be but wasn't in a rush to get there. Maybe it was how he never turned his head, not even as my truck roared past him. I checked my mirrors. He was gone. I tapped the brakes, just enough to slow down, but something inside me said, "Don't stop." I listened to that feeling, kept my foot on the gas. A few minutes later, I glanced at the mirrors again, and my stomach dropped. The man was walking along the side of the road. Again, same suit, same slow, steady pace. Only this time, he was ahead of me. I know what you're thinking. You imagined it. You're tired. It was a trick of the road. That's what I told myself too. Until I passed him, and he turned his head. I only saw his face for a split second. But that was enough. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were completely black, like two empty sockets. And his mouth, God, his mouth was too wide, stretching up into a grin that looked like his skin had been pulled too tight. I slammed the gas. I didn't care about speed limits, didn't care if I got pulled over. I just knew I had to get away. But when I looked in the mirror again, he was in the middle of the road, standing still, watching me. And then he started running. Not like a person, not like anything human. 1 second he was standing still, the next he was sprinting toward me, arms pumping, legs moving too fast, like a puppet on invisible strings. I don't remember much of what happened next. My instincts kicked in, my foot went all the way down on the pedal, and I focused on the road. I drove for nearly an hour without slowing down. When I finally saw the lights of a small truck stop up ahead, I nearly cried in relief. I pulled in fast, parked near the other trucks, and sat there for a long time just trying to catch my breath. I didn't look at my mirrors. Didn't want to see if he was still out there. Eventually, I climbed down, my legs still shaky. The place was almost empty. Just a couple of other truckers inside, a tired-looking cashier behind the counter. I grabbed a coffee, sat at the counter, and tried to calm myself down. Then an old man sitting in the corner spoke up. "You saw him, didn't you?" I looked up. "What?" He took a slow sip of his coffee. The man in the suit. A cold chill ran down my spine. "You know about him?" The old man nodded. "He's been out there a long time, since before I was a driver." He set his cup down, eyes tired. "Some folks say he's a ghost. Others say he's something worse." I swallowed hard. "What does he want?" The old man shrugged. "No one knows. Some say he's looking for something. Some say he just likes to follow people. See who gets scared." I didn't sleep that night, didn't even go back to my truck for hours. When I finally worked up the nerve, I checked every mirror before stepping inside. He wasn't there, but I never took that route again. And I never ever stop when I see someone walking the highway at night, because I know now some things out there aren't looking for a ride, they're looking for something else.
Story number 3.
It was the dead of winter, somewhere along a desolate stretch of I-80 in Nebraska. I was just a young guy back then, eager to make a name for myself as a trucker. Hauling goods across states was tough, but the freedom of the open road was worth it. At least that's what I told myself before that night. The snow had started falling earlier in the afternoon, turning the highway into a ghostly ribbon stretching through a wasteland of white. I remember squinting through the windshield, the wipers working overtime against the swirling flakes. The CB radio crackled occasionally, static-filled voices from other truckers trying to break through the storm. Most of them were pulling over for the night, but I was stubborn. I had a delivery deadline, and I was determined to push through. As darkness swallowed the sky, the storm intensified. The road was eerily empty. No headlights ahead, no taillights behind. Just me, the hum of my engine, and the relentless wind howling like something alive. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, waving frantically. Now, any seasoned trucker will tell you picking up hitchhikers is a bad idea, but something about this guy made me pause. He looked desperate, bundled up in a tattered coat, snow clinging to his hair. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. He climbed into the cab, shivering violently. "Thanks, man." He gasped, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Thought I was going to freeze to death out there." "No problem," I said, though my gut was already twisting with unease. "Where you headed?" He hesitated. "Just up the road a bit. Anywhere warm, really." That should have been my first clue something was off. Nobody was just up the road in a storm like this. Still, I shrugged it off and focused on driving, the tires slipping slightly on the icy pavement. We rode in silence for a while, the only sound the engine's rumble and the occasional hiss of the wind. I stole glances at him when I could. He was pale, with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. His hands were clenched into fists on his lap, knuckles white. "You a trucker too?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Used to be," he said quietly. "Been off the road for a while." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just down on his luck. God knows I'd met plenty of guys who'd fallen on hard times in this line of work. As we drove, the storm seemed to worsen. The snow was so thick it felt like driving through a wall of static. The CB radio crackled again, a voice barely audible through the interference. "Wreck. Mile marker. Be careful out there." I strained to hear more, but the signal was gone. I glanced at the guy next to me. He was staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "You hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" he said, his voice flat. "Something about a wreck up ahead." He didn't respond, just kept staring into the swirling snow. My nerves were shot, but I didn't have a choice. I had to keep going. That's when I saw the wreck. A twisted mess of metal and shattered glass sprawled across the highway. My headlights caught the glint of something red, blood, stark against the snow. I slowed to a crawl, heart racing. "Looks bad," I muttered. The hitchhiker said nothing. As I eased the truck past the wreckage, my stomach turned. There were bodies, at least 2, maybe 3, lying motionless in the snow. The mangled remains of a semi loomed in the darkness, its cab crumpled like a tin can. "That could have been me," I whispered. The hitchhiker finally spoke. "Yeah," he said softly. "It could have been." There was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl. I glanced at him again, and my breath caught in my throat. His face was wrong. Pale, yes, but now almost translucent. His eyes were dark pits, void of any humanity. "What the hell?" I started, but my voice caught in my throat. He smiled then, a cold, hollow grin. "You should have kept driving," he said. My foot slammed down on the gas, the truck lurching forward. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I just had to get away from him. But the faster I went, the more it felt like the cab was closing in around me. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The radio crackled again, but this time the voice was clear. "You're not supposed to be here," it said. I whipped my head around, but the hitchhiker was gone. Just gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if he'd never been there at all. My hands trembled on the wheel, and for a moment I wondered if I was losing my mind. But the fear was real. The wreck, the blood, the bodies, those were real. I kept driving, my eyes darting to the passenger seat every few seconds. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop miles down the road, the storm finally easing into a gentle flurry. I stumbled out of the cab, legs weak, and made my way inside. The place was nearly empty, just a bored-looking cashier and a couple of truckers nursing cups of coffee. I collapsed onto a stool at the counter, my heart still racing. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the cashier said with a nervous laugh. "Maybe I have," I muttered. One of the truckers leaned over. "You come through that mess on I-80, he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, bad wreck back there." He frowned. "Wreck? Ain't been no wreck on I-80 tonight." My blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about? I saw it. Bodies and everything." The trucker shook his head. "Been clear all night, far as I know." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I'd seen was real, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just sat there, numb. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that stretch of highway. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me in the storm. But one thing's for sure, I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled alone.
Story number 4.
It was the kind of night every trucker dreads. Thick fog rolling across the lonely backroads of West Texas, the landscape swallowed in an endless gray void. My route had taken a detour due to construction on the main highway, leaving me on a desolate two-lane road that stretched on like a nightmare. The CB radio was silent except for occasional bursts of static. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was just another night behind the wheel. I told myself. Nothing I hadn't handled before. But then I saw it. A pair of taillights flickering in the distance. They appeared suddenly, faint through the fog. I was relieved at first. Another driver on this godforsaken road meant I wasn't entirely alone. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The taillights weren't moving. The vehicle was just sitting there in the middle of the road, completely still. I slowed my rig, headlights slicing through the fog to reveal an old rusted sedan, its paint peeling and windows fogged up. I pulled alongside it, rolling down my window. "Hey, everything all right?" I called out. No response. The driver's seat was empty, the door slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze. My gut told me to keep driving, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, blood, maybe. My boots crunched on gravel as I approached the sedan. The driver's seat was stained dark and claw marks ran across the dashboard. My throat tightened. "Hello?" I called again, my voice wavering. Silence. I shined my flashlight into the surrounding darkness, the beam cutting through the fog. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading away from the car and disappearing into the thick brush by the roadside. They were erratic, like whoever made them had been stumbling. Against every instinct screaming at me to get back in my truck, I followed the tracks. The fog muffled every sound, turning the world into an eerie, muted void. The footprints led deeper into the brush until I found myself standing at the edge of a small clearing. And there it was. A house. It shouldn't have been there, not out here in the middle of nowhere. The wood was warped with age, the windows dark and lifeless. A faint yellow light flickered through a cracked door, swaying gently on its hinges. I should have turned back, but something about that light drew me in like a moth to a flame. As I approached, the smell hit me. Rot and decay, thick enough to make my eyes water. My boots creaked on the warped porch as I pushed the door open wider. The inside was worse than the outside. Cobwebs draped across the ceiling, dust coating every surface. But it wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped at a rickety kitchen table, back turned to me. "Sir?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was wrong. Its head cocked at an unnatural angle, the skin pale and stretched taut. My flashlight beam trembled as I shined it toward the table. That's when I saw the carving. Deep grooves etched into the wood, forming symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse under the beam of light. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere deeper in the house. "Leave." The word crawled over my skin like 1,000 icy needles. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted for the door, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the fog thickened around me, clinging to my skin like a living thing. I couldn't see my truck, couldn't even see the road. Panic gripped me as I stumbled forward, hoping I was heading in the right direction. The whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "You shouldn't have come. Stay. Forever." I tripped, sprawling onto the cold, damp ground. The fog swirled around me, shapes forming and dissolving like phantoms. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering in my chest. And then I saw it. A shadow moving through the fog, impossibly tall and contorted. Its limbs twisted in ways that defied logic, stretching and contracting as it moved toward me. I ran. The fog pressed in on all sides, the whispers blending with the pounding of my boots against the ground. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. The shadow was right behind me. I could feel it, hear its unnatural movements slicing through the air. Finally, I saw the faint outline of my truck through the fog. Salvation. I lunged for the door, yanking it open and hauling myself inside. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the key, shoving it into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun on the slick road before catching traction, the truck lurching forward. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if that thing was still behind me. The fog thinned as I sped down the road, heart racing. The whispers faded, replaced by the familiar hum of the engine. It wasn't until I reached the next town, miles away, that I finally pulled over at a brightly lit truck stop. My hands were still shaking as I climbed out of the cab, the cold air biting at my skin. Inside, The warmth and hum of conversation felt surreal. I found a seat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and tried to steady my nerves. "Rough night?" the waitress asked, setting the mug in front of me. "You have no idea," I muttered. Another trucker nearby overheard and leaned over. "You take that back road through the fog?" I nodded, my throat dry. He shook his head. "People around here don't drive that road at night. Not anymore." "Why not?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He took a sip of his coffee. "They say there's a house out there, been abandoned for decades. Folks who see it don't come back right in the head, if they come back at all." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're lucky, man," he said, his voice low. "Real lucky." I stared into my coffee, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill lodged deep in my bones. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I didn't need to. Some things are better left unsaid, and some roads should never be traveled after dark.
Story number 5.
The sky was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. The only thing keeping me company was the steady rumble of my rig and the faint static from the CB radio. I was hauling a load through the back roads of Louisiana, far from any sign of civilization. Miles of swampy, desolate land stretched in every direction. It was supposed to be an uneventful night, but truckers like me know better. The road has a way of showing you things you'd rather forget. The first sign that something was wrong came just past mile marker 66. The air inside the cab suddenly felt colder, prickling my skin despite the heater blasting at full force. My headlights cut through the dense fog that had crept up without warning, clinging to the road like a living thing. Then I saw it. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road, barely visible through the fog. I slowed the truck, squinting to make out the shape. It was a woman dressed in a tattered white dress that clung to her frame. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands, and she stood unnaturally still, facing away from me. I should have kept driving. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hit the gas and leave her behind. But there's a code among truckers. You help people when you can. And she looked like she needed help. I pulled to a stop a few feet ahead of her and rolled down the window. "Ma'am, you okay out here?" She didn't move. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the wheel. The fog swirled around her, making it hard to tell if she was even real. But then she turned, slowly, deliberately. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes... God, her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck the light out of the air. My breath caught in my throat. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Every fiber of my being told me to drive away, but I found myself climbing out of the cab, heart racing. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer, just turned and started walking toward the swamp, her bare feet leaving no tracks on the damp ground. I hesitated, glancing back at my rig, the only beacon of safety in this god-forsaken place. But curiosity, or maybe some misplaced sense of duty, pushed me to follow her. The fog thickened as we moved deeper into the swamp, the trees twisting like skeletal arms overhead. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and stagnant water. My boots sank into the muddy ground with every step. "Where are we going?" I demanded, my voice sharp with unease. She didn't respond, just kept walking, her movements eerily smooth. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. I froze, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. "We need to go back," I said, my voice trembling. She finally stopped and turned to face me. Her expression was blank, but there was something sinister in the way she stared at me. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. Before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled backward into the muck. The growling grew louder, closer. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet. Shapes moved in the fog, twisting, writhing shadows that defied logic. Eyes glinted in the darkness, too many to count. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled backward, heart pounding. The woman's form flickered like a static image on a broken TV. Her face twisted into something grotesque, her mouth stretching wide in an inhuman grin. "Run," she hissed. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted back toward the road, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. The growls grew louder, the shadows closing in around me. My boots slipped on the muddy ground, but adrenaline kept me moving. The fog thinned just enough for me to see my rig, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. I sprinted toward it, lungs burning, every instinct focused on survival. Behind me, the shadows shrieked, a sound that would haunt my nightmares forever. I reached the cab and hauled myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the key. shoving it into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas. The tires spun for a heart-stopping second before catching traction. The truck lurched forward, and I didn't look back. The fog clung to the road, but the further I drove, the thinner it became. The growls faded into the distance, leaving only the hum of the engine and my ragged breathing. I didn't stop until I reached a brightly lit gas station miles down the road. My legs felt like jelly as I climbed out of the cab, the cool night air biting at my skin. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the cashier gave me a curious glance as I stumbled to the counter. "Rough night?" he asked. "You could say that," I muttered, my voice hoarse. He nodded knowingly. "You take that back road through the swamp?" "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. He leaned closer, his expression serious. "Locals call it the Devil's Stretch. A lot of folks see things out there, things that ain't supposed to exist." I swallowed hard, the memory of those twisting shadows and the woman's hollow eyes still fresh in my mind. "You're lucky you made it out," he added. "Not everyone does." I didn't have a response. What could I say? That I'd followed a ghost into the swamp and barely escaped with my life? I finished my coffee in silence, the warmth doing little to chase away the lingering chill in my bones. As I climbed back into my rig, I made a promise to myself. I'd stick to the main highways from now on. No detours, no back roads. Some places are best left forgotten, and some roads are better left untraveled.
Story number 6.
The road stretched endlessly into the Arizona desert, bathed in pale moonlight. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of my rig the only sound keeping me company. There wasn't a soul in sight, just miles of cracked asphalt cutting through a barren wasteland. I'd heard the stories from other truckers, strange lights, shadows moving where they shouldn't, and voices that echoed through the empty desert. I'd always chalked it up to sleep deprivation and overactive imaginations, but that night I learned the road has secrets it doesn't want you to know. It started around midnight. My eyes were heavy, and I was contemplating pulling over for a quick nap when I saw it. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road. A hitchhiker. He was tall and lanky, dressed in a dusty plaid shirt and jeans. His thumb was out, a hopeful gesture in the middle of nowhere. I knew better than to pick up strangers, but something about him made me slow down. Maybe it was guilt. No one deserved to be stranded out here. I rolled down the window. "Need a lift?" He nodded, his face hidden in the shadows. "Appreciate it," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He climbed into the cab, settling into the passenger seat with an unsettling ease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside. Maybe I was just tired. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Just up the road," he said vaguely. I nodded and focused on the road, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction. The radio crackled with static, and I turned it down. We rode in silence for a while, the weight of the hitchhiker's presence pressing down on me. I stole a glance at him. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. "You been out here long?" I asked, hoping to make conversation. "Long enough," he replied, his lips barely moving. A chill ran down my spine. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The desert was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no tire tracks on the road behind us. My rig should have left a clear trail in the dust, but there was nothing, just smooth, untouched asphalt. My stomach twisted. I glanced at the hitchhiker again. He hadn't moved, still staring straight ahead. "You all right?" I asked, my voice wavering. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine. They were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to pull me in. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice cold and hollow. My heart raced. I slammed my foot on the brake, the truck screeching to a halt. The hitchhiker didn't flinch. "Get out," I demanded, my voice shaking. He smiled, a slow, eerie grin that sent a wave of nausea through me. "Too late for that," he said. The air inside the cab grew heavy, thick with a strange, metallic scent. The desert outside had changed. The moonlight was gone, replaced by an unnatural darkness that swallowed everything whole. Shapes moved in the shadows, slithering and writhing like things born of nightmares. My breath caught in my throat as whispers filled the air, voices overlapping in a cacophony of madness. "You brought this on yourself," the hitchhiker said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Panic surged through me. I threw the truck into gear, tires spinning as I gunned it down the road. The darkness pressed in on all sides, the headlights barely cutting through it. The hitchhiker was gone. One moment he was there, and the next he wasn't. The passenger seat was empty, as if he'd never been there at all. My hands trembled on the wheel, sweat slicking my palms. But the terror wasn't over. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around the truck. I could see shapes now, twisted, grotesque figures with too many limbs and eyes that glowed with malevolence. I floored the gas, the engine roaring as the truck hurtled down the road. The figures chased after me, their movements impossibly fast and erratic. The road twisted and warped beneath my wheels, stretching and narrowing like a living thing. The landscape was a nightmare. Trees sprouting from the ground only to wither and die in an instant. "Come back," the voices whispered. "Join us." I gritted my teeth, refusing to look back. The truck shuddered as something slammed into the side, but I kept my foot on the gas. The headlights caught glimpses of the creatures, elongated limbs, mouths filled with rows of jagged teeth. Desperation fueled me. I needed to get out of this hellish place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The darkness lifted, replaced by the familiar expanse of desert bathed in moonlight. The whispers faded into nothingness, and the road returned to its normal, cracked state. I pulled over to the side, heart pounding, and stumbled out of the cab. The cool night air hit me like a slap, grounding me in reality. I looked back down the road, half expecting to see those creatures lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just an empty stretch of highway. The hitchhiker was gone, and so were the nightmares. I climbed back into the cab, hands still shaking. The radio crackled to life, a familiar voice cutting through the static. "Anyone out there? Weird night, ain't it?" I grabbed the mic. "You have no idea." As I drove off into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the road had marked me somehow. The desert had its secrets, and I'd come too close to one of them. I still drive those lonely highways, but I don't stop for hitchhikers anymore. Some doors should never be opened, and some passengers should never be picked up.
Story number 7.
The highway stretched endlessly through the flat Kansas plains, the night pressing down like a suffocating blanket. My headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt and the occasional tumbleweeds skittering across the road. I was hauling a load of farm equipment to Denver, running late thanks to a blown tire earlier in the day. It was past midnight when I spotted it. A rusted, weather-beaten gas station sitting alone at the edge of nowhere. The flickering neon sign read, "Last Stop Gas," in faded red letters. I wasn't desperate for fuel, but nature was calling, and the idea of stretching my legs was too tempting to pass up. I pulled my rig into the gravel lot, the crunch of tires echoing in the still night. The place looked abandoned, but the dim glow from inside suggested otherwise. I climbed down from the cab, the cool night air biting at my skin. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The smell of stale air and motor oil hit me immediately. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the shelves, stocked with dusty cans of oil and faded bags of chips. Behind the counter stood an old man with a weathered face and eyes that gleamed unnervingly in the dim light. He didn't say a word, just nodded as I entered. "Bathroom?" I asked, my voice echoing in the emptiness. He jerked his thumb toward a narrow hallway at the back. "Thanks," I muttered, making my way past the shelves. The hallway was dark, the only illumination coming from a flickering bulb near the restroom door. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled damp and musty. I pushed open the bathroom door, wincing at the squeal of rusty hinges. The restroom was as grimy as I'd expected. Cracked tiles, a flickering light, and graffiti scrawled on the walls. I did my business quickly, eager to get back on the road. As I washed my hands, the mirror above the sink caught my attention. The reflection was wrong. The room behind me seemed darker, deeper, and there was something moving in the shadows, a shape I couldn't quite make out. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Long hauls do that to a person. I splashed cold water on my face, avoiding the mirror, and hurried back toward the front of the store. The old man was still there, watching me with those unsettling eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice rough like gravel. "Yeah, just tired," I lied. He nodded slowly. "Road plays tricks on you at night." I paid for a bottle of water and turned to leave when he spoke again. "Be careful out there," he said quietly. "This road's got history." I didn't ask what he meant. I just wanted to be back in my truck, away from this strange place. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way back to the rig. The night seemed darker now, the stars obscured by thick clouds. I climbed into the cab, locking the doors out of instinct. The engine rumbled to life, and I pulled back onto the highway, eager to put distance between myself and that eerie gas station. But the road had other plans. About 10 miles down, the air inside the cab grew heavy, thick with an oppressive silence. The radio crackled with static and the dashboard lights flickered. I frowned, tapping the radio dial, but the static only grew louder. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as the truck skidded to a stop. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silhouetted against the darkness. It was the old man from the gas station. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way he could have gotten here before me. It was impossible. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. Slowly, he lifted one hand and pointed to the side of the road where an old dirt path led into the darkness. I shook my head, refusing to play along with whatever this was. I shifted the truck back into gear and started to drive around him. But he was gone. Vanished. I blinked, my heart racing. The road was empty, as if he'd never been there at all. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on the road ahead, but my gut told me something was very wrong. A few miles later, the fog rolled in, thick and impenetrable. My headlights barely cut through it, and the world outside became a swirling void. I slowed the truck, gripping the wheel tightly. Shapes moved in the fog, fleeting glimpses of twisted forms that darted in and out of view. My skin prickled with fear. Then the whispers started. Low, guttural voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the malice was unmistakable. I clenched my jaw, refusing to give in to panic. This was just another trick of the night, I told myself. Nothing more. But then the laughter began, high-pitched and echoing like children playing a cruel game. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something pacing the truck, keeping up with my speed. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I hit the gas, the engine roaring as I tried to outrun whatever was out there. The fog thickened, swallowing the road, but I didn't dare stop. The whispers grew louder, the laughter echoing inside my head, and then just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The fog lifted, revealing the familiar stretch of highway bathed in moonlight. The voices faded into silence, and the air felt lighter. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. The night was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. I sat there for a long moment, trying to catch my breath. Eventually, I got back on the road, my nerves frayed but intact. I didn't stop until I reached the outskirts of Denver. The city lights a welcome sight. I never did figure out what happened that night. Maybe it was the road playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something far darker. All I know is that I don't take that route anymore. Some roads remember, and some places never let you forget.
Story number 8.
I've been on the road most of my life. You see things out here, things that don't make sense. Most truckers got a story or two, something they swear happened but never talk about twice. Me? I never believed in ghosts, demons, none of that crap. Thought it was just road fatigue, tricks of the mind. But that was before the night I picked up a hitchhiker. It was about 3 years ago. I was hauling a load through northern Arizona, somewhere along Route 89. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and the road was dead. Just me, the hum of my rig, and miles of nothing but open desert. The radio was nothing but static, so I drove in silence, letting my thoughts wander. That's when I saw her, a woman walking alone on the side of the highway. Now, you don't see many people out there at night, especially not alone, and definitely not dressed like she was. She had on this pale blue dress, looked vintage, like something out of the 50s. It was torn and dirty, like she'd been walking for miles. Her hair was long, dark, and tangled. She didn't have a bag, no phone in her hand. Just walking barefoot along the shoulder of the road, staring straight ahead. I slowed down. Against my better judgment, I pulled over a few yards ahead of her. Maybe she'd been in an accident. Maybe she needed help. I leaned over, rolled down the window. "Ma'am, you all right?" She didn't answer, just kept walking. My gut told me to leave. Something wasn't right. But I couldn't just drive off. I put the truck in park, jumped down, and stepped toward her. "Hey, miss, do you need a ride? It's dangerous out here." That's when she stopped. Not like a normal stop. No hesitation, no slowing down. 1 second she was moving, the next completely still. Then she turned her head toward me. Not her body, just her head. The way she moved, it wasn't natural. That's when I saw her face. Pale, too pale. Eyes too big, too dark, like deep wells of nothing. Her lips cracked and dry, barely covering her teeth. But what got me, what sent a cold spike of fear straight through me, was her smile. Wide. Too wide. Like her skin was being pulled back from the inside. I took a step back. Every instinct screamed at me to run. But before I could move, she spoke. I knew you'd stop. Her voice was wrong. Too soft, too smooth. Like it wasn't coming from her at all. Like it was inside my head. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, faster than anything I've ever seen, she was right in front of me. I didn't see her move, didn't hear a single footstep. But suddenly, she was inches away, staring up at me, still smiling. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't work. You always stop. I don't know how, but I forced myself to move. I stumbled back, scrambled into the truck, slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely shove the key into the ignition. I looked up. She was standing right outside my door, still smiling. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and tapped on the window. Tap, tap, tap. I damn near pissed myself. The truck roared to life and I floored it. The tires skidded, kicking up dust and gravel as I tore away. My heart pounded so hard I thought I was dying. I didn't dare look in the mirrors. I drove for miles, hands clenched so tight on the wheel my knuckles went numb. Finally, I saw lights up ahead, some small 24-hour diner. I pulled in, parked, and sat there trying to catch my breath. I looked in the mirror. She was gone. But the fear didn't leave. I got out, walked into the diner, still shaking. The waitress took one look at me and poured a fresh cup of coffee without a word. "You all right, driver?" she finally asked. I took a sip, hands trembling. "I don't know." She watched me for a moment, then said, "You saw her, didn't you?" I froze. "Saw who?" Her face went pale. "The woman on the highway." A chill ran down my spine. "You know about her?" The waitress glanced at the old man sitting at the counter. He hadn't said a word since I walked in, just stared down at his plate. Now, he looked up. His eyes were tired. "She's been out there a long time," he said. "Long before the road was built." I didn't want to hear more. Didn't want to know. But I had to ask. "What happens if you stop for her?" The old man sighed. "Some people, they don't leave." I gripped my coffee, my throat dry. "And the ones that do." He looked me dead in the eye. "She follows." A cold dread settled over me. I didn't finish my coffee, didn't say another word. Just left a few bucks on the counter and got the hell out of there. I drove straight through till morning, eyes flicking to the mirrors every few minutes. Every shadow looked like her. Every bump in the road felt like she was crawling up behind me. Even now, 3 years later, I don't stop for anyone. I don't care if they look hurt, lost, desperate, because I know what's out there and I know she's still waiting.
Story number 9.
I've been a trucker for a long time. Seen plenty of weird things on the road, things I could explain and things I couldn't. But nothing haunts me quite like what happened one night on Route 65, somewhere between Kentucky and Tennessee. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 a.m., and I was hauling a load of steel beams down a quiet stretch of highway. The road was mostly empty, just a few cars passing every now and then. The night was pitch black, no moon, and the only light came from my rig's high beams cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw the truck. Up ahead, pulled off to the shoulder, was an old semi. Looked like something out of the 70s. Rusted cab, faded paint, a dull logo on the side I couldn't quite make out. The hazard lights were blinking weakly, like the battery was barely hanging on. Now, truckers, we look out for each other. It's an unspoken rule. If someone's broken down on the side of the road, you check in, offer help if they need it. So I slowed down and pulled over just ahead of the old rig. As soon as I stopped, something felt wrong. The road was dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of my own engine humming softly. My headlights cast long shadows over the abandoned truck. The cab door was slightly open, swaying just a little like someone had left it in a hurry. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from my truck. As I stepped closer, my boot crunched on something. Glass. The driver's side window had been shattered from the inside. That's when I noticed the blood. A dark smear across the doorframe. My stomach twisted. I called out, "Hey, you okay in there?" No answer. I shined my flashlight inside. The cab was empty, but it looked wrong. The seats were torn up, the dashboard was cracked, and the entire interior was coated in a thin layer of dust, like it had been sitting there for years. But the engine was still warm. I backed up, my skin crawling. That's when I saw the footprints, leading away from the truck into the darkness of the trees. They were uneven, like whoever made them was limping. The trail disappeared into the thick forest beside the road. I should have left. Every instinct in me was screaming to get back in my truck and drive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help. Maybe the driver had been attacked, tacky. Maybe he had run off, injured. Maybe he was just waiting for someone to find him. I took a breath, pulled my phone from my pocket, and turned on the flashlight. I followed the footprints. The forest swallowed the light almost immediately. The trees were thick, their branches curling overhead, blocking out the sky. The ground was damp, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth. The deeper I went, the worse I felt. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrongly quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it, a shape crouched in the dirt just ahead. I froze. My flashlight beam flickered over the figure. It was a man, thin, frail, his back turned to me. He was wearing a filthy trucker's jacket, his hands digging into the earth like he was searching for something. "Hey," I called, my voice unsteady. "You all right?" Slowly, the man stopped digging. His fingers twitched. Then he turned his head too far, not just to glance over the twisted, unnaturally, almost all the way around, his bones cracking like dry wood. His face, God, I can still see it. It was wrong. Skin pale and stretched too tight over his skull. Eyes sunken and dark, his mouth too wide, curling up at the corners like it had been cut into his face. And then he smiled. I ran. I didn't think, didn't care. Just turned and bolted back toward the highway, my breath ragged, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it would explode. Behind me, I heard something moving. Fast, branches snapping, leaves crunching, and then a thin, wheezing laugh like something struggling to breathe. I broke through the tree line, sprinting for my truck. My headlights were still on, casting a pool of safety on the empty road. I dove into the cab, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my keys as I turned the ignition. My headlights hit the old truck one last time, and I swear to God, the man was standing beside it, watching me, his head still tilted, that awful grin never fading. And as I peeled out, tires screeching against the pavement, I caught a glimpse of the truck's faded logo. Holloway Freight Co., EST 1972. I didn't think much about it until later. When I looked it up, Holloway Freight had shut down over 30 years ago. And that truck, it had disappeared along with its driver in 1986. They never found him. Some say he just vanished. Others say something took him, and now I think I know what. I still drive Route 65 sometimes, but I don't stop for broken down trucks anymore. Because I know now, some drivers never really leave the road.
Story number 10.
I've been a trucker for over 15 years. I've driven through blizzards, tornadoes, and stretches of roads so empty and dark you'd swear you were the last person left on Earth. But nothing has ever come close to the night I drove through Red Hollow. It wasn't even a real town, just a name on an old map. One of those places that had dried up and disappeared long before I ever hit the road. I was hauling a load from Missouri to Arkansas, taking a back road shortcut my dispatcher had suggested. It was a lonely route, winding through miles of dense forest, no houses, no gas stations, just trees pressing in on both sides. The sun had set hours ago, and my headlights were the only thing cutting through the blackness. The road was empty. Not another car, not even a street sign. Just me and the sound of my tires against the pavement. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer or some animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a dusty old suit. He had his back to me, just standing there on the shoulder, his head slightly tilted down. I passed him, my stomach tightening. I kept my eyes on the road, but I checked my mirrors as I drove by. He was gone. I didn't think. I just gripped the wheel tighter and kept going. A few miles later, my radio crackled. At first, it was just static. Then, "You should stop." My heart nearly stopped. The voice was whispery, broken, like it was coming from a long way off. I grabbed the CB, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, "He's waiting for you." A cold chill ran down my arms. I shut the radio off. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, in the middle of the road, stood the same man. The exact same man. Same suit. Same tilted head. Only this time he was facing me. And his face? There was no face. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched over his skull, like a mannequin. My hands went numb. I swerved, barely missing him as I roared past, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't dare look in the mirrors this time. I just drove. Faster. I kept telling myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the eyes, maybe my mind playing games with me. Then the fog rolled in. Thick. Unnatural. It swallowed the road, my headlights barely piercing through. I had to slow down, my grip so tight on the wheel my knuckles ached. That's when I saw the town. It wasn't on my GPS. Hell, it shouldn't have been there at all. Old, wooden buildings with broken windows and leaning porches lined the road. A single street light flickered weakly, casting long, stretched shadows. The place looked like it had been abandoned for 100 years. But there were people standing on the sidewalks, dozens of them. Men, women, children, all dressed in outdated clothing, motionless, silent, watching. My breath hitched. My truck crawled forward, the engine the only sound in the eerie dead town, and then the figures moved. Not walking, not stepping, just shifting. 1 second, they were on the sidewalk. The next, they were closer, then closer. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and dark, mouths slightly open like they were whispering something just below hearing. My foot slammed the gas. My truck roared forward, tires squealing against the pavement. The fog thickened, swirling unnaturally as I tore through the empty town. The people didn't chase me, they just watched. I don't know how long I drove. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the town was gone. The fog vanished. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark like nothing had ever happened. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles down the road. The clerk, a young guy with tired eyes, noticed my hands were shaking when I paid for my coffee. He asked if I was okay. I told him I had just come through a strange little town up the road. He frowned. "What town?" I told him. His face went pale. "There ain't no town on that road," he said. "Not for at least 50 miles. I didn't argue, just got in my truck and kept driving. I still take that route sometimes, but I don't stop because I know now Red Hollow isn't on the map. It's waiting for you.
Story number 11.
I've been a trucker for nearly 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of weird things on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever shaken me like what happened one night in the deep back roads of Tennessee. It was a stormy night, rain hammering against my windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. I was on a 2-lane highway surrounded by thick forest on both sides. No streetlights, no cars, just me and my rig, hauling a load through the darkness. I had planned on stopping at a truck stop about an hour ahead, but the weather had other ideas. The wind was howling and the rain was coming down so hard it looked like static on my windshield. My CB radio crackled with the occasional chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just white noise. Then, through the downpour, I saw something. A figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart jumped into my throat. I slammed the brakes, my tires skidding against the slick pavement as my rig groaned to a stop. The figure didn't move. It was a woman. She was barefoot, standing there in the rain, her long hair plastered to her face. Her dress was thin and soaked through, clinging to her frame. She was facing away from me, her shoulders shaking like she was crying. I don't pick up hitchhikers. It's an unwritten rule among truckers. You never know what you're getting into. But something about her standing there in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a storm, didn't sit right with me. I flicked my high beams, hoping she'd move. She didn't. I reached for my horn, but before I could honk, she turned. My breath caught in my chest. Her face, God, her face was all wrong. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark and hollow. Her mouth was too wide, stretched into an unnatural grin, and she was whispering something, but I couldn't hear it over the rain. Every instinct in me screamed to get the hell out of there. I slammed the gas. My tires spun against the wet road before finally catching traction, and I swerved around her, my heart hammering as I sped off into the storm. For a few minutes, I thought I was in the clear. My breathing slowed, my grip on the wheel loosened just a bit. Then my CB radio crackled to life. A voice came through, soft and distorted. "Why did you leave me?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was her voice, that whispering, broken voice, coming through my radio. Then I felt it, a presence, in my truck. The air turned ice cold. My breath fogged in front of me. The smell of rain and something rotten filled the cabin. I didn't want to look in my mirrors, but I did. And there she was, sitting in my sleeper, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her empty eyes locked onto mine. I swerved. My truck skidded across the wet road, and I fought the wheel with everything I had, my heart nearly exploding out of my chest. Then she laughed, not a normal laugh, a warped, guttural noise like something choking on its own breath. I gritted my teeth and did the only thing I could think of. I prayed. I don't know why. I hadn't set foot in a church in years, but right then, in that moment, I muttered every prayer I could remember from when I was a kid. And just like that, the air turned warm again. The smell vanished. The laughter stopped. I pulled over at the first gas station I found and sat there for nearly an hour, my hands shaking too bad to drive. I checked my sleeper. Empty. But the seat was still wet, like someone had been sitting there. I don't drive that highway anymore, and I don't stop for anyone standing in the rain, because I know now some things on the road aren't meant to be picked up.
Story number 12.
I've been driving rigs for a long time, seen my share of weird things, shadows crossing empty highways, voices coming through the radio when there shouldn't be, truck stop rumors about roads that don't lead anywhere. But nothing sticks with me like what happened 5 years ago on a remote stretch of Highway 50, out in Nevada. They call it the loneliest road in America, and trust me, it earns the name. Miles and miles of nothing but desert, broken down towns, and old forgotten gas stations that seem like they've been abandoned for decades. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Reno to Salt Lake City. It was just past 1 a.m. and I was running on fumes. My plan was to make it to Ely, a small town with a decent truck stop, but the fuel gauge dipped lower than I liked and I knew I wouldn't make it. Then I saw a sign. Last chance gas, 5 miles. Didn't recognize the name of the station, but out there, you don't question luck, you take it. The place showed up right when my gauge hit empty. A small, rundown station on the side of the highway, one flickering light above the pump, an old wooden building behind it. Looked like something out of the 50s. No other cars, no other trucks, just me and the empty desert. I pulled up, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The air was dry, smelled like dust and old asphalt. The attendant was already outside. I didn't see him come out, didn't hear a door open, but there he was, standing by the pump, waiting. Thin guy, pale skin, sunken cheeks. His uniform was old, faded blue with a name patch that just said, "Bill." "You're lucky," he said, his voice dry like wind over sand. "Most folks run dry before they reach us." I tried to laugh it off. "Yeah, guess I got lucky." Bill didn't laugh. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. I handed him my card, but he shook his head. "Cash only." I frowned. That should have been my first red flag. But I had cash, so I handed him a couple of bills. He nodded, walked to the pump, and started fueling. That's when I noticed the price per gallon. I blinked. That had to be wrong. Hadn't been that cheap in over 40 years. Before I could ask, something caught my eye. A dim light coming from inside the station. The store looked empty, shelves covered in dust, but something in there was moving. A shadow shifting behind the counter. I glanced at Bill. He was staring at me now, the pump still running, but his hands completely still, like he'd forgotten what he was doing. Something in my gut told me to leave. Right then, I cleared my throat. "Hey, restroom inside?" Bill nodded, slow and stiff. Back left corner. I stepped toward the building, feeling his eyes on me the whole way. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was worse than I thought. It smelled like old oil and something rotten. The shelves were mostly bare. What little food remained was decades old, labels faded and peeling. And then there was the counter. Behind the register stood another Bill. Same uniform. Same pale skin. Same sunken cheeks. But he wasn't moving. Just standing there, eyes wide open, mouth slightly agape, like a mannequin. I backed up, my chest tightening. The restroom was just ahead, but I wasn't about to use it anymore. I just needed a second to think. Then the lights went out. Pitch black. A cold, heavy silence settled over the room. Then a whisper, right next to my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." I spun, reaching for the door handle, but my fingers met something else. A hand. Cold. Bony, gripping my wrist. I yanked back, stumbling away, heart hammering. The emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The bill behind the counter was gone. The store was empty, but the door wasn't there anymore. Where the entrance had been was just more wall, covered in dusty shelves. I turned, pulse pounding. The only other exit was the restroom. I ran for it, shoved the door open. Inside was not a restroom. It was the desert, an endless stretch of sand and rock beneath a black, starless sky. I felt my stomach drop. The gas station was gone, my truck was gone, the road was gone. Then I heard the whispers. Not one voice, hundreds, soft and distant, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Then, in front of me, something stepped forward. Not Bill, not human. Tall, thin. Skin stretched too tight over a skull-like face. No eyes, just hollow black pits where they should have been. And that smile, too wide, too sharp, curling up like it had been carved into its face. It took a step toward me. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. The landscape never changed. Just desert and that black, empty sky. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it. A horn. Faint at first, then louder. A truck horn. I turned my head and saw headlights cutting through the dark. A massive 18-wheeler barreling straight toward me. At the last second, I jumped, and suddenly I was back. lying in the middle of Highway 50, headlights blinding me as another truck screeched to a stop just feet away. The driver jumped out, yelling, "Jesus, man, you okay? What the hell are you doing out here?" I couldn't answer. I just stared at the highway, at my truck still parked at the gas station. The real gas station. The one I should have stopped at instead. I don't remember much after that. The trucker who found me helped me up, made sure I was okay. But when I turned to look at the gas station I had actually stopped at, the old one was gone. No sign of it, no sign of Bill, just empty desert. I don't stop for gas in the middle of nowhere anymore, and if I ever see another last chance sign, I'll keep driving. Because I know now, some places on the road don't exist. Not really.
Story number 13.
I've been trucking for nearly 15 years. You get used to the loneliness, the long nights, the empty roads stretching into the dark. But some nights, some places, they're different. This happened 4 years ago, somewhere in the back roads of Kentucky. I was hauling a refrigerated load through a 2-lane highway surrounded by thick forest. My GPS had rerouted me due to construction, taking me off the interstate and onto this quiet, forgotten road. It was past midnight, and there were no streetlights, no towns for miles, just my headlights cutting through the trees. The road was rough, cracked in places, barely maintained. I didn't like it, but I had a deadline to meet. I drove for about an hour without seeing another car. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a sign. Last stop, gas and rest, 2 miles. It wasn't on my map, but I figured I'd top off the tank, maybe grab a coffee. Something about that road made me uneasy, and I wanted to shake the feeling before I kept going. 2 miles later, I saw it. A lone gas station sitting on the side of the road, surrounded by darkness. It looked old, like it had been built decades ago and never updated. The neon open sign flickered weakly. There was a single car parked outside, an old rusted sedan. No other trucks, no movement. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The air was thick, humid. The station had one dimly lit pump and a small convenience store with dirty windows. Inside, a bald man stood behind the counter, watching me. I walked in, nodding to him. Even in. He didn't nod back, just kept staring. Up close, he looked wrong. His skin was too pale, almost gray under the fluorescent lights. His eyes were sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I felt something cold creep up my spine. I cleared my throat, trying to shake the weirdness. "Just need some gas and coffee. You got a restroom?" The man didn't answer. He just slowly, real slow, raised one bony finger and pointed to the back of the store. I forced a smile and walked past him, heading toward the restroom. The store was eerily quiet. No hum of refrigerators, no buzzing lights, no music playing overhead. Just silence. The restroom door was old, yellowed with age. I pushed it open, stepping inside, and that's when I saw the writing on the mirror. Scrawled in what looked like dried blood were 3 words. "Don't talk. Run." I stared at it, my breath hitching in my throat. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Coming toward the restroom door. I turned, my pulse hammering. The knob twisted. I backed up, heart pounding, looking around for another exit. There was none. The door creaked open. It was the bald man. But something was different now. His smile was wrong. Stretched too wide, as if his skin barely fit his skull. His teeth were yellow, sharp. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me, grinning. Then, in a voice that wasn't his, a voice that sounded layered like more than one person speaking at once, he said, "You shouldn't have stopped." I ran, shoved past him, bolting for the door. As I did, I caught a glimpse of the security mirror above the counter. The bald man wasn't alone. Behind him, in the dark corners of the store, were figures. Dozens of them, too tall, too thin, their limbs too long. Watching, waiting. I didn't stop. I tore out of there, jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. The bald man stood in the doorway, still grinning. Then, as my headlights hit him, I saw it. His shadow wasn't his. It was something else. Something much, much bigger. I slammed the gas, tearing out of that lot, tires screeching. I didn't look back. I drove for nearly an hour, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't slow down, didn't stop, didn't dare check my mirrors. Finally, I saw another gas station. This one lit up, modern, with trucks parked outside. I pulled in, breathing hard, shaking. Inside, I found the clerk, a young guy, and asked him about the old station down the road. He frowned. "What station?" I told him. "Route 89. About an hour back. The last stop gas." His face went pale. "Sir, there hasn't been a gas station on that road for over 30 years. My stomach dropped. I tried to argue, but he was already shaking his head. It burned down in the 80s. some kind of accident. A few people died, workers, a couple of travelers. Nobody ever rebuilt it. I didn't sleep that night. I still take that route sometimes, but I don't stop, even if I'm running on fumes, because I know what's waiting there, and next time they might not let me leave.